Hey, how's it going out there? This is Tim Laskus, and you're listening to The Tim Laskus Show, episode 18. And today's featured guest is Brett Gajda. Brett trains coaches, professionals at Fortune 1000 companies globally, around the world, folks. He's a writer, and he's a host of Where There's Smoke podcast. It doesn't stop there. He's launched not one, but two multi-million-dollar businesses, and he studied with some of the world's leading self-development teachers. He's visited 40 different countries. He released an album, and he's even started a musical. This guy's like a true Renaissance man, so you better stay tuned. Enjoy.
The Tim Laskus Show, in search of entrepreneurial gold. Tim digs deep into the minds of his guests. Entertaining, down to earth, and informative. Now, here's your host, Tim Laskus.
Welcome, everyone, to the Tim Laskus Show. I'm super happy to have Brett Gajda as my guest today. Brett, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Tim.
Hey, I was a little nervous pronouncing your last name, but I was able to get it right. So I know you said it's pronounced Gajda, but it's spelled with G-A-J-D-A, correct?
Correct. Yeah, the J kind of tries to trick you there.
Yeah. Now, we were talking just a few moments ago, and you are preparing to ride your bike around the world. Is that correct?
Well, not quite around the world, no. Across Canada.
Across Canada.
But that, being that we're the second biggest geographic country in the world, it's still pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how long are you going to be training before you actually take off for this ride across Canada?
Well, the ride takes place in September. It's an organized ride. It's called the Sears National Cancer Ride. So it's a kind of fundraiser and awareness ride for children's cancer. So it's organized as 40 of us that'll be riding, kind of raising money for the cause and raising awareness. And it takes place over 3 weeks. So I've got from now till basically September. I think we leave Vancouver on September 4th and ride across to Halifax. So I've got whatever that is from when this airs, it'll be a little shorter, but right now I think it's 6 or 7 months to train.
Oh, okay. So what is I don't know how to put it into words. What's the best way to prepare your butt for that long distance? Because, man, after about 30 minutes on that bike, I'm already hurting and squirming. And do you have like a special seat or something? Like, how does that work?
No, you know what I've found over the years is somehow you're I don't know what it is. I don't know if your butt just builds up tolerance or if it it gets used to it or what it is. But the only way to really prepare for it is just to ride a lot. And there's a point when you ride a lot when your body just gets used to it and it manages it. So I'm not quite sure how that works. Now, that said, that's not to say that on a long day you might not still be a bit sore, but yeah, you definitely get used to it. And again, I have no medical explanation for that. I just know that if you ride a lot, there's a point where that stops being an issue.
Well, I like that. We could probably have a whole show on butt tolerance.
There you go.
Yeah, that would get listeners in. They're like, what? What are you, butt tolerance? What kind of show is that? So that's for another day, folks. So that might be coming up. But anyway, well, Brett, tell the listeners a little bit about what your focus and kind of area of expertise is professionally.
Well, I am I really work in the area of, I would say, personal development and self-development, both with regards to each of us as individuals as well as companies and organizations. So I think the way that I like to phrase it is I'm all about helping people figure out how they can be better. Whether that's their mindset, their communications, their relationships, their culture, across the board. So I work with big companies. I work with Fortune 1000 companies and executive teams. And then I also have a podcast called Where There's Smoke, which is really more aimed at everybody on the planet, I would say, as far as, how can we be better human beings?
Right. Now, with your personal development, so you're giving, do you go in and give like talks and workshops and as well as coaching on that?
Yeah, probably the thing I do the least out of all three of those is coaching. I do that selectively, but more what I do is, either workshops, so either working with small teams of kind of, 10 to 15 people over a day or 2 days or 3 days, or keynotes and talks, coming in and doing an hour talk or a 2 hour talk about different topics. And again, always with the intention of asking questions and kind of stirring the pot and much like you do in coaching, getting people to kind of figure out their own answers, right? Not coming in from a standpoint of, let me tell you how to do it, but coming in from a standpoint of, let me present some different perspectives and some different questions that might help you figure out alternative ways to approach these challenges.
Right. Now, do you incorporate any emotional intelligence into your...
Definitely, 100%. Yeah, it's one of my wheelhouses, I would say.
Right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of emotional intelligence. And for people who are listening right now who are like, emotional, what? Can you tell them a little bit about what EQ is?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to describe it, right? The kind of grandfather of emotional intelligence is William Goldman. I hope I got that right. Who wrote a book called on emotional intelligence, and he describes 4 quadrants, which I kind of always use to explain emotional intelligence. So basically, it's made up of 2 things. It's made up of kind of your relationship with yourself and your relationship with everyone else. So with regards to a relationship with yourself, it's self-awareness. So how well do you know yourself, right? And then it's self-control. How well can you control your own emotions and show up and behave the way you want to in every occasion, or how often do maybe your emotions get the best of you? And then from an other standpoint, it's social awareness. So again, just understanding kind of what's around you. If you walk into a room and you kind of have that feeling like, oh, wow, there's a lot of, I feel like this room has got a lot of anxiety in it. That's social awareness, kind of having a feel for, how people around you are feeling. Or, if you and I are friends, Tim, for me to, be able to read you and go, wow, I think Tim's really happy today, or I think Tim's upset. And then the other piece of that is relationship management, basically, which is really my ability to then relate to people around me, or to influence people around me, or to communicate effectively with people. So when you take those 4 aspects, you basically have emotional intelligence, which shows, how well I know myself, how well I can control myself, how well I can, know others, and how I can interact with them.
Yeah, there's so many leaders out there, supervisors, managers, who just really have no clue about that. And their only focus is the details of the task, of either their task or the task of those who they're to apparently supervise. And when they have that mentality that I need to supervise someone, that's a real issue, because people don't need supervision. People want to be built up. And when there are managers or supervisors or leaders out there who go in and just tear people down, they're not doing a great job. But I think many of us, a lot of the listeners can probably identify with having a boss or supervisor at one time who would come in and they knew when a good day was to ask for some time off and when it was not a good time to ask, because they wore their emotions on the sleeve. And so with that, people will often, they just kind of stay away from those leaders. And I would say that, those leaders have really poor, emotional intelligence, not being aware of themselves. And then also, not understanding, like you said, to have that social awareness of those people who are around them and what's going on with them. And that takes a while to kind of develop. And wouldn't you say, or is that more of an innate kind of, people either have that ability or they don't?
My perspective on it, which is really just that, is that I tend to think that to a certain level, we're all born with it, because I think as kids, we're very intuitive, and I think we pay attention to a lot of things. And I also think that emotional intelligence really runs through your own self-awareness, meaning that my ability to have social awareness, be aware of others, to read others, to be empathetic to others, to build relationships with others, it really filters through my self-awareness. I would say it's very difficult, in my opinion. If you were to grade yourself in those quadrants, it would be very difficult, if not almost impossible, to have great social awareness and great relationship management without good self-awareness, right? Because ultimately we see in others what we see in ourselves first. And if we can't see it in ourselves, we won't see it in others. And by the same token, we often project on others. So it's all kind of connected. So I tend to feel like what happens is people are born with a pretty high emotional intelligence. We're very aware. And then throughout life, things happen, maybe we have a lot of fear, or we get hurt, so we tend to shut down. So then you start to shut down, and when you shut down, you build walls. When you build walls, you are less able to kind of connect with people. People tend to not want to look at their own kind of programming, right? Their own belief systems. So as people distance themselves from their own self-development and self-awareness, they also in turn create less social awareness. So I tend to believe that we're born with it at a pretty high level. And then what happens is however we adapt through life, we end up shutting down or blocking our emotions in different ways that actually impair that ability.
Wow, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, Brett, you've launched a couple of multi-million-dollar businesses. Could you provide some tips for those entrepreneurs out there, sidepreneurs who are like, oh man, this guy must really know what he's talking about, which you do. Can you provide a couple of tips for those who are ready to kind of follow in your footsteps and also, make their stake in entrepreneurship?
Well, I mean, it's funny because that's true, right? Factually true that I've created, two multi-million-dollar businesses, but it sounds more impressive even to me than it really was, right? I mean, I did manage to build, two businesses that both did multiple millions of dollars, neither one of them more than 10 million a year, but still pretty good. But I think more than that, what I'm proud of that I've built is really my lifestyle, that I've built a career since my mid to late 20s, and I'm now 45. So the last 20 years, I've really managed to build, businesses and a career that fits my lifestyle. And, I would say it's so hard, right, to give a couple of tips. What are a couple of tips? I think one thing that I've done, I've never been someone who's really burned the ships, right? There's that metaphor that you totally burn the ship, right? You just leap off one thing into another thing. And if the second thing doesn't succeed, then you are screwed kind of thing. I've never done that. I've always kind of hedged my bets, meaning that I've never really left one thing until I had something else at least kind of started, or I've started a side business. And then once I got it to a point where I felt like, okay, I'm not making as much money as I want, but I could survive. I could eat craft dinner and live. Then I'll take the leap, because ultimately there is a leap, right? There is a point where if you're launching something, it has to have all of your attention and all of your focus. So I've always kind of operated from this standpoint of stay in the black, from a financial term, right? You're in the red, you're in debt, you're in the black, you're at least breaking even or making money. And for me, that's about staying in the game, right? Because I think what I see people do is, let's say they have a job and they really want to start their own business. And, they're very reckless about it, and they start it up, and then, maybe it's making $250 a month and they go, that's it, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to go for it. And that is probably going to work for 1 in 1,000, maybe 1 in 10,000. But if you're not the one who it works for, then what happens is you knock yourself out of the game. And then all of a sudden, the next thing you know is, you're going out looking for a job because you got to kind of pay your rent and get back in the game. And so I've never, since, the last time I had a job, quote unquote, I was 26 years old, I think. And I've never had a job since. I've done some contract work. I've taken on projects to bridge gaps. But I've always just done whatever it takes to stay in the game and stay in the black. And I think that's important. And again, I'm not saying that's for everyone, but for me, that idea of hedging my bets has been important. And then the other thing I'd say is to really own your time. It's interesting. Just yesterday, I saw this video on Facebook. Actually, it was Warren Buffett and Bill Gates being interviewed by Charlie Rose. So if you want to look it up, it should be pretty easy to find. And Bill Gates was talking about how Warren Buffett taught him about time. And how Warren really guards his time. He doesn't schedule things back to back. He doesn't give his time away. He creates a lot of open time. And what Bill was saying was, sometimes to just sit there and have hours where you're just thinking. You're just thinking about things and contemplating things can be more valuable than any busy work you could be doing. And I think one thing I've always tried to do, and I haven't always succeeded greatly at it, but I've always tried to really own my time and schedule my time and schedule everything that I do. One tool I'll give you, your listeners, that I learned years ago is this idea of, which is called play, prep, pay. And the idea being, initially it was taught to me by a guy who had small kids and he would plan his whole year. And the idea being that he would plan his play first and then his prep and then his pay. So meaning that he would look at his entire calendar for the year and he would decide, okay, when are we going to take vacations? And he said he kind of had to, right? Because his kids were in school and they had certain times off. But he started planning, this is the week we're going away. This is the weekend I'm going to spend with my kids. He planned all of his fun, all of his life fun. Then he planned his prep. So basically, what courses do I want to take? What conferences do I need to go to? All the things that are going to be me learning. Let me schedule all my learning. And then when he was done, he said everything that was left over, that was my pay, which means those are the times I'm actually going to go out and, do sales or do delivery or do whatever it is that pays me money. And he said, look, at the end of the day, there's more than enough time to make money. But if you focus on making money first and you tell yourself that, you'll learn when you have time, or you'll take that vacation when you have time, anyone out there who's done it, including me, knows that you end up never reading that book and never taking that vacation. So that idea of planning your play and your prep first, and then, letting whatever's left over be where you make your money, is something that served me as well.
Wow, that's very powerful, Brett. And I couldn't agree more. I love that. And so that is just gold right there, what you shared with us. So when did you realize that you wanted to be an entrepreneur, and kind of what helped you to make that leap into that new kind of chapter in your life?
I wasn't one of those people I never decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur, quote unquote, right? Like I wasn't one of those kids who had like a lemonade stand and was always like, yeah, like I want to have my own businesses. When I was a kid, I thought I was going to grow up to be an actor or a rock star. I guess I always knew that I didn't want to have a quote unquote job, but I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I think what happened to me, and it happened, to answer your question, it probably started happening in my mid 20s, but I came to the decision in my kind of late 20s. What happened wasn't so much that I realized I wanted to be an entrepreneur. What happened was I realized I didn't want to work for other people. And I didn't like a lot of the criteria, I guess I would say, the elements is a better word, of, a job and a kind of a career working for other people. I didn't like set hours. I didn't like doing a lot of the same stuff every day. I didn't like being in the same place 5 days a week. I didn't really like working for others back then. I found I butted heads with them a lot. Now I love partnerships. So I like working with other people. I still don't necessarily like working for other people. I like teamwork and partnerships. So I think I realized that. I realized, my mom made a joke when I was probably a late teenager, or maybe even my early 20s, I think late teenager. And the joke was that when I was a teenager, she often spent more money on buying my uniform for whatever job it was I got than I would ever make at that job. because basically within a few weeks I would quit, or they would fire me, and it was never my fault, because I always had a viewpoint of how things could be done better, right? Being the kind of cocky little kid I was, and really, ignorant at that point in my life. And so I think I just realized that I didn't want to do that. And then what I also realized in my like around 30 was how important lifestyle was to me. And like I just said, and how I wanted to ultimately, I knew what I wanted my life to look like. I knew what I wanted my life to look like. And then it was all about, okay, what will my career look like in order to serve that life? And so that's what I really decided. And, from that point, as far as the initial step goes, I was, they talk about how you're either driven by pleasure or pain. And I think I was more driven by pain, the pain of working for other people, the pain of that boredom of routine that I didn't like. And so I kind of followed my bliss, to use the term, and just said, I'm going to go do things that I enjoy doing. And I'm going to, move away from that stuff. And that's what started me on my journey. And honestly, there was never a day where I was like, oh, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. It just kind of happened. And, here we are 20 years later, and that's what I am.
Well, I'm willing to bet there are many listeners out there who identify exactly with what you said, because so many people listen to Gary Vaynerchuk's, his videos, and just his talks and things that he gives. And he's always just so driven. And he talks about selling baseball cards and going to yard sales and buying stuff cheap and selling it more expensive. And he just said, I was driven, as a young kid. And so I think it leaves a lot of people scratching their head going, wow, I was never that driven. So I guess maybe entrepreneurship is not for me. But from your story, you weren't like that. You were driven from, well, I just don't want to work for anyone. I don't necessarily know that I have that entrepreneurial, drive to go out and, buy something for 10 cents and sell it for $1. You just knew that you didn't want to work for someone else. And I think that's what a majority of probably the listeners out there have is they just don't, didn't want to work for someone. They wanted to create something different. But I think maybe started second guessing whether they had that ability after listening to some of those high achievers who, rant and rave about, oh yeah, I had a bottle in my mouth and I was also, renting out my baby blanket, or something, from an early age. So I think that is great that you shared that story, because I think a lot of people can identify with what you said.
Yeah, and I would add that, like I said, the joke my mom made, I mean, I was never that person that, I don't know, like, if anything, I would think of myself maybe as being a bit lazy, to be honest. Now, I'm tenacious. When I sink my teeth into something I want, I'm pretty tenacious. But at the same token, not only jobs, I mean, I took a few months of trumpet lessons, a few months of piano lessons, a few months of guitar lessons. I remember I joined Cub Scouts for a year. I convinced my buddy to do it with me. Halfway through it, I didn't want to do it anymore, and I quit. And then his parents made him do it another year, and he always was pissed at me for that. Like I was more of a quitter. I was more of a starter and a quitter than a starter and a finisher from a quantity standpoint. And again, there were things that I sunk my teeth into that I mean, I don't have that track record, and so I would say to people out there that you don't have to be that type of person. There's lots of different ways to get from point A to point B. And, I found mine.
That is just wonderful. And, I'll never forget what you said about your mother spending more money on your uniforms than you ever made. Did she also ever sit down with you and tell you, okay, Brett, this is how you manage money and this is how to be responsible? Did you ever have that talk growing up?
I didn't have that talk growing up. I feel like, when it comes to kind of an understanding of money or business or finances, I feel like I had very little, if any, growing up. It's interesting. I was doing an interview probably about a year ago, and they asked me, if there's people out there kind of just coming out of school, 22, 23 years old, they're just getting into their career, their business, or whatever it's going to be. And what advice would you give them? And I said, look, I'll give them advice that I never got and I never took, which is hire a financial advisor. Because here I sit at 45 years old and, I'm doing all right. But I'll tell you what, if I had hired a financial advisor at 25, I would be retired right now. I mean, no question. I mean, the first business I started that we, built up to a $5 million business, that was my late 20s, early 30s. I made a significant amount of money and I ended up saving very little of it. I had a really good time. But, in a very easy way, putting away a little bit extra money every month that I wouldn't even have noticed, I could have set myself up easily. So, it's kind of almost the one regret I have, if I have any, but I try not to, because you never know, where our path would go if we did something different. But I would say that, like, I've always said that, like, it's not that hard to retire, really, if you start early. If you get ahead of the game and you get a simple plan, and, it can look like putting a couple $100 away a month, and you could do some pretty incredible things in 20 years. So, yeah, I don't think I did. I mean, the one thing I will say is, my dad worked very hard. He ended up buying, the business that he worked for, he ended up buying it with 3 partners, I think when he was 41, 42. But I never got a sense that my dad was a slave to his job. I got a sense that he worked hard. And my dad passed away when I was 50, or when he was 50, when I was 18, which is why I'm talking about this kind of in past tense. I always got a sense that he worked hard. And I always felt like he worked hard, not from a place of, I have to, or I don't want to get fired, or what. He did it from a place of pride. He did it from a place of that idea that if you're going to do anything, do it with excellence. And so, that wasn't necessarily advice about money or finances, but I think I got that from my dad, that understanding that, take pride in your work. And I've done that in my life. But yeah, man, if I had a financial advisor when I was 25, I'd be probably talking to you from Bora Bora right now.
Sitting in your hammock, drinking out of your coconut or
That's right.
pineapple or whatever it might be. Well, Brett, it sounds like your father was a major influence in your life and a very special person. And kind of what I take away from this is it's okay. Maybe we didn't get those messages early on, but man, go out there and hire somebody who knows about, financial, setting you up, who's a financial advisor. And that's what it's all about is, okay, don't worry about what you didn't get. All right, surround yourself with the people who know about it and get on board and get on track.
Yeah, in that interview I did about a year ago, I said something that I really liked when I listened back. I was like, oh, if you're ever going to quote me, quote that. And what I said in the interview was, a lot of times people think just because they can make money, they know how to manage it. And that's not true, right? You could be really good at making money. You could make $1 million a year, but that doesn't mean you know how to manage it. You know, everyone knows how to have kids. It's real easy. You know, grab a girl, grab a boy, hop into a room and get busy and you can make a kid. But just because you can make a kid doesn't mean you know how to raise it, right? I mean, you know, making something and actually managing something is very different, right? So I would say that, you know, just understand that it's, you know, they're two different expertise. And yeah, go out and hire someone who has the knowledge and, you know, build that support system.
Love it. Making money does not equal managing money. And also what I take from this, Brett is telling you, do not go out and buy a new Lamborghini.
No.
When you only made $1 million, don't go and buy that
Yeah,
Lamborghini.
yeah. I've watched enough sports athlete documentaries to know that doesn't end up very well in the end.
It sure does. When you can't afford to change the tires and you know, the oil changes and stuff on those cars, yeah, it's probably not a good idea that you buy one. But anyway, well, thinking back, since you've started a few businesses, you've been in the trenches, you know what it's like to be out there and rolling up your sleeves and struggling. Can you recall a situation that was mentally challenging for you, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure there's been many. One of the things I've realized about myself over the years is I have an optimistic memory, which I think a lot of people might relate to. Just mean that when I'm in something, it might feel horrible, and then 2 years later, when I think back on it, I'm like, yeah, that wasn't that bad, right? So I tend to remember things as not being as maybe as difficult as they were. I will say this because I can't think of kind of a specific situation necessarily, but I think two things. One, I already mentioned earlier, so I won't talk too much about it, but is that idea that I've always tried to stay in the black. You know, I've always tried to stay in the game. And I heard this this idea years ago, a guy named Marshall Thurber, who's kind of a business speaker, philosopher in some ways. And he talked about this idea of the difference between risk and risky. And, this is just how he equated it, but he talked about it like a board game. And he said, it's like snakes and ladders, right? And he's like, I'll do something if it's a risk, but I won't do it if it's risky. Right. And again, this is just semantics, just how and he said, a risk is like snakes and ladders. It's something, if it doesn't work out, you land on the snake and you have to go back to kind of position 2 on the board, right? So you might have gotten all the way to position 55 and then you lose most of your money and you go back to position 2. And he said, but risky is something that knocks you off the board. And he actually had a snakes and ladder board and he knocked his piece across the room. And he's like, you're out of the game, And so it's kind of like, if you had $10,000 to your name and you bet, 9,000 of it on the Super Bowl, that's a risk. But if you bet 10, that's risky, right? Or if you bet 20 and borrow 10 off somebody else, like the idea of whatever you do, don't let it knock you off the board has been something that has helped me, because then when you are in those stressful situations, you know that, okay, this is bad, but the worst case scenario, I can survive. And I think that's helpful. The other thing I'll say is I'm a big believer in meditation and just even in general, the idea of taking space and time. And I think that's probably been another go-to for me is if I am, really up against it and I'm really challenged and it's all encompassing, I will step away, and that step away might just be meditating for an hour. That step away might be going and doing a weekend retreat where I don't just totally step away. But I find that space can really provide valuable perspective and kind of, going back to emotional intelligence, kind of get you back to control of your emotions. And from that place, you often have a different perspective and you're often able to make better decisions on how to move forward in those kinds of situations.
Well, it sounds like you've really had a steady course of success. You had a clear path. You knew where you were going. You knew how to manage, the risk, and you also took care of yourself along the way. So it doesn't sound like you've ever had those moments where you were just, ready just to say, I'm done with everything. I mean, although we all have those kind of moments, but it just sounds from what you're saying is that you've set yourself up for success and not for failure, not risking everything at once. And then also taking care of yourself along the way which gives you that ability to keep going when times get rough. And so then you never interpret anything as being just super overwhelming, and you just have that positive mindset is what it sounds like.
Well, I think what you just said is part of it is perspective, right? So when I really think about the hardest times in my life, they're more connected to personal than they are to business. And as I mentioned earlier, my father died when I was 18, and that was by far the most difficult period of my life. And as I got through that, and it took me, a couple of years, I think, to really at least get through it. And it still affected me my whole life. But I remember thinking at that point in time that, kind of, knock on wood. I mean, I have a 5-year-old now. I mean, unless I was someday to get married and have a child and something happened to that child, I couldn't imagine that anything worse than losing my dad would happen to me in my life. And so there is something to be said for that. It's kind of like when people say, they've had multi-million-dollar businesses and lost it all. And once you've done that, you always believe you can do it again, or you have a different perspective. That perspective for me of that experience of losing my dad, I think everything else after that felt like it could never be as bad. And so there is something to be said for that, that idea of how we look at a situation. And maybe that's why I have an optimistic memory, or I don't know. But I think what you said is right, is that I tended to, things happen and I tend to just kind of look at them and absorb them and take a moment to let them sink in, and then realize they're not as bad as they look, and figure out a way to step forward and just take one step forward. You don't have to solve the problem. You just have to figure out how to take the next step. And then from there, figure out the next step.
Yeah, well, and again, it just sounds like, your dad just had such a major impact on your life, and that, almost the rug was pulled out from under you, and, nothing could compare as far as, being that bad. And nobody will truly understand, that pain unless they're in your shoes, even if they have a similar experience. My father passed away probably about 4 years ago, and, I'm 45 now, and I agree. It's been the most traumatic experience in my life. And I'm under the impression that time doesn't heal. I can't think of anything, more tragic. And, it just changed my life forever. And so, hearing you talk about, that experience with you and your father, and, kind of reflecting on my father, it definitely changes you. And I can't imagine, being 18, I was already 40, and, and what kind of, major impact that it caused me. But, yeah, once you have an experience, like that, where you interpret as being, very, very severe, everything else that comes after that just kind of seems like, okay, nothing can compare. So I can manage or handle that, but, your ability to be able to focus on the positive seems pretty overwhelming. So what would you say is probably a standout, most fulfilling moment of your entrepreneurial journey?
Oh, wow. I mean, there's been many, right? And, I think starting that first company, I remember the first year I made 6 figures. I was like, whoa. And actually, again, connected to my dad, kind of, I remember I saw a tax return of my dad's when I was a kid, and it was like $80,000 or something. And for whatever reason, I made this decision at that point. That's, the most amount of money he'd ever made. Now that I know about business, and he owned his business, I'm sure it was more than that. But I remember at that point in time when I made 100,000, I thought, man, did I just make more money in a year than my dad ever did? And there's actually a psychological concept around that, around, sons who make more money or feel like they had more success than their dad, and what that feels like. But just that in general, just making that benchmark that, in some ways means nothing, but in some ways is like, oh, okay, I'm a success. That was huge. And just being the best at what I did at that point for a good long while. And then once I got into, moved into more speaking and self-development, my first kind of foray into that, I worked for a self-development company, and I went through a very intense training over a year and a half to teach a 3-day course around North America, where I helped people to kind of identify their belief systems and what was working for them and what wasn't. And I had amazing experiences doing that. And now with the podcast, recently I've been going through some stuff because my mom's actually in the hospital, and the letters I've been getting from our listeners from around the world. I mean, from Dubai, Vietnam, Australia, America, Canada, Switzerland, France, Spain, like people telling me that they're thinking about me, but also like describing the difference our shows made. I got a letter from a woman just 3 days ago, basically telling us that our show helped her find the courage and the strength to leave an abusive relationship she'd been in for years.
Wow.
And, that I don't even know what to do with that some days, right? So I think, to know that my words, my presence is making a difference, that's powerful to me. And I think it's that idea that, each of us are just one person, right? But if we can leave the world better than we found it, then I feel like that's success. And so if I just came into this planet and just kept to myself and never spoke to anyone, I would make no impact. But if I even help 5 people feel more fulfilled in their life or create more happiness or, have something more that they wanted, then I've multiplied myself by 5 in some ways, right? The contribution of this one person has helped 5 people. So to me that, right now is a very fulfilling moment in my professional journey to know that, these shows that we're making and what we're putting out into the world is helping people. That's a really humbling thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the impact that you have on people in their life, and when they share those personal stories with you, they can be just so touching, and that's what will stay with you forever and a lot longer than any money that you receive from from a job or from your business. And so and I liked what you said, being able to, to leave the world, a better place. And I think for all of us to have our purpose in life very clear. And once we have a purpose that, how can we make people's life better? How can we contribute to the world? And many people think being an entrepreneur is all about me, and it's selfish and it's greedy. And it's really not. It's about serving others. It's about helping people. And, look at everything that Bill Gates and his foundation has done, to help people around the world. So yeah, that is just one of the most powerful things about being an entrepreneur. So Brett, we're at the end of the show. You've shared some golden nuggets of wisdom, and I know the listeners have really enjoyed this. And before we leave, though, I would like to give you a chance to let the listeners know how they can contact you and find your podcast and maybe find you on social media.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. So the podcast is called Where There's Smoke, as in the idiom, where there's smoke, there's fire. You can find it literally anywhere you listen to podcasts. So iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen, you'll find it. You can find our website at wherethere'ssmoke.co. And contacting me. I mean, I love to hear from people and connect with people. I have a new website for me, which is just brettgajda.com. So that's BRETTGAJDA.com. You can find me on Twitter, the same thing, at Brett Gajda. And then you can also email me directly, Brett, BRETT, at wherethere'ssmoke.co. So lots of places to find me. Where There's Smoke's on Facebook as well. And, I'd encourage you guys, if, some of what I've said today has been impactful for you, take a listen to our show. It's very highly produced, meticulously crafted. We bring in movie clips, audio clips, all kinds of fun stuff. We treat it as more of a TV show than a podcast almost, but we try to entertain while we inspire and kind of educate. And just take a look. We have, I think, 58 episodes. You can kind of look at the titles and find one that maybe calls to you and give it a listen and, see if you want to listen to another one after that.
Brett Gajda, everyone. Brett, thank you very much for your time. You've been a spectacular guest, and I look forward to staying in touch and following you on your continued journey.
Right on. Thanks so much, Tim.
All right, take care.
Want more entrepreneurial tips? Go to timlaskas.com.